Eruvin, Daf from Hay through Yud Aleph. On Daf Hay, the Gemara gives us a couple of guidelines about characteristics a mavoi and ali has to have before it's eligible to be fixed. Niskan with a lechi and kara. Brisa says, Ein mavoi nitar belechi v'kara, unless it has batim and chatzeros psuchim l'tocho. It has to have chatzeros, courtyards opening into the mavoi, and the chatzeros have to have batim within them. The Gemara brings another statement. Rav Nachman says, Ezu mavoi shenitar belechi v'kara. What properties does a mavoi have to be able to have the tikkun of lechi and kara? It has to be arko yesral rachbo. It has to be longer than it is wide, a rectangle. And it has to also have batim v'chatzeros psuchim l'tocho. It also has to have the courtyards opening onto the mavoi and houses within those courtyards. We pass in this way in Shulchan Aruch that you have to have batim v'chatzeros psuchim l'tocho and arko yesral rachbo. And then, as we noted in the previous share in this series, the Ramah says today for all our mavos we don't do lechi b'kara. We do a full-blown tzuras of Pesach. Why? Because our mavos have the status of chatzer, not of an actual mavoi, and therefore they aren't eligible for lechi b'kara. They can only have tzuras of Pesach. Mishnah Berurah explains why are our mavos not considered mavos? Why are they only chatzeros? Because they failed the first test. They don't have batim chatzeros psuchas l'tocho. So they don't have the status of mavoi, which Chazal gave certain leniencies for us to use lechi b'kara. It has different standards, and we use tzuras of Pesach. The Mishnah Berurah notes that even if our mavos are treated as chatzeros, chatzer also has a tikkun short of tzuras of Pesach. Chatzer, you can have the tikkun of two l'chayayim. Not one lechi like a mavoi, but two l'chayayim, one on each side, which is 2/3 of a tzuras of Pesach. The two vertical poles, but you shouldn't need the horizontal pole. So why can't we do that? Why do we need a full tzuras of Pesach? So the Mishnah Berurah says that's based on a second chumrah, that sometimes you have a mavoi mefulash, it's open on both ends, and then the halacha is that you need tzuras of Pesach at least on one end, and that's why you need tzuras of Pesach in those cases. So because of that, in all cases, the minhag is to avoid the complication. The Eruvin is complicated enough as it is, but to avoid complications and to standardize things, every mavoi we do tzuras of Pesach. Now the Mishnah Berurah continues in this vein. If that's the chumrah is that maybe it's mefulash, you really only need tzuras of Pesach on one side. On the other side, it would be enough to have two l'chayayim, like a chatzer. Even if it's mefulash, it only needs on one side. So the Mishnah Berurah says, nevertheless, he says the minhag is to have tzuras of Pesach everywhere, and that's l'chatchila. That's what we do. We always rely l'chatchila on tzuras of Pesach. All this discussion of lechi and kara, we don't do any of that l'chatchila. Mishnah Berurah discusses b'diavad, if the top part fell down on one side of one of the two open sides of a mavoi, whether you can rely on the two l'chayayim, but l'chatchila, we do everything as a tzuras of Pesach. Later, the Gemara discusses if closing up the mouth of a mavoi with a pas, with a board, a partial partition. Talks about how if the mavoi is exactly 8 amos, the Gemara says, then the Gemara makes an interesting calculation. It says manavshach. If you put a board in the middle around 4 amos long, so a lechi can't be 4 amos. But 4 amos it doesn't qualify as a lechi. It's too big to be a lechi. But the Gemara says if the mouth of the mavoi is exactly 8 amos, then the thing in the middle is roughly 4 amos, roughly halfway. The Gemara says manavshach, it's okay, because if it is more than 4 amos, it can't be a lechi anymore. But then you don't need a lechi, because now you have omein meruba. That's a concept we're going to get into in a bunch of the next few blot, that an opening that needs to be closed in Eruvin, if you have omein meruba, if most of it is closed, it's as if it's all closed. So if it's 8 amos long and you have 5 amos, a board closing off 5 amos, that's omein meruba. 5 out of 8 is omein meruba. If the board is less than 4, less than halfway across, it's only 3 amos, then it can be a lechi. If it's less than 4 amos, it qualifies as a lechi. So manavshach, more than 4 is omein meruba. Less if the mavoi is exactly 8. Less than 4 is lechi. What's the problem? Maybe it's exactly 4. If it's exactly 4, on the one hand, it's too big to be a lechi. On the other hand, it's not omein meruba anymore. It's not omein meruba. It's only 4. 4 out of 8. Omein kapara. It's a discussion in the Gemara later. So in that case, it's a problem, the Gemara says. But in that case, you don't have to worry about that case, because it's a suffix. It's a suffix devram. In either case, where it's more or less than 4, it's fine. It's only a problem if it's exactly 4. It's a suffix drabanan, because the mavoi has 3 walls. and this is only a din drabanan to close the fourth side. Safek devreim lahakel, misafek, we can be mekel. It's drabanan, we can be mekel. Elsewhere, the Gemara has a rule in Eruvin, halacha devreim mekel be'eruvin, that when it comes to questions, machlokes in an Eruvin, we can be mekel, we paskin like the mekel. Some say only on machlokes tanaim, some say machlokes amaroim, some say everywhere. But here, in this Gemara and in various other cases throughout the Masechta and the Rishonim, besides the klal of halacha divrei mekel be'eruvin with all its limitations, there's another klal that many issues of Eruvin are drabanan. Many, maybe most, certain cases are daraisa, but many issues of Eruvin are only dinei drabanan. In those cases, we invoke this klal of halacha divrei of savik divrei lahakel. The question is, do we always say this klal? Do we say this klal sometimes? There are many questions in Eruvin we discussed in our previous share. Some poskim say that an Eruv which is public should be built according to the highest standards. You shouldn't rely on kulos. Al-Kalpan, and here the Gemara explicitly says Safek Devrei Lahakel. You could argue the Gemara means here it's not just a suffix. It's a very narrow suffix. If it's more or less than 4, it's okay. It's only if it's exactly 4, it's a problem. It could be that's a very low probability of suffix. Tosha says it might be more of a real suffix. But in any event, here the Gemara says Safek Devrei Lahakel in an Eruvin Din Drabanan, and we shown throughout the Masechta also frequently invoke this principle that when you're dealing with Dinim Drabanan and Eruvin, besides the klal of halacha divrei mekel be'eruv, there's another klal of safek divrei lahakel. When you do say it, when you don't say it, is a pretty thorny and difficult question to reconcile all the cases where poskim do say halacha divrei mekel, where they do say safek divrei lahakel, when they don't say it, is a complex question. On Davav, we have a sugya, again, it begins on the end of Dafei, goes on to Davav. The Gemara talks about openings that are not, when you have an opening in the middle of a wall of a chatzor or a mavoi, you just have a gap, part of the wall fell down. The general rule is 10 amos. If the gap is less than 10 amos, it's okay. It's considered just like a doorway, even though there's no tzuras of Pesach. More than 10 amos or more is a problem. So that's a regular breach in the middle of a wall. But if it's at the corner, the Gemara has different cases of Rosho and Tito, but in the corner, basically the Gemara has a rule. The Gemara says the problem is less. The Gemara says it can be even 4 tvachim can be a problem. The Gemara says Pischa b'karen zavius la'avdi inchi. People don't make doorways and corners. It's not the way construction is normally done. Pischa b'karen zavius la'avdi inchi. We paskin this way in Shulchan Aruch. Normally the halacha is that if it is more than 10 amos, I said before 10 amos, the Shulchan Aruch says more than 10 amos, then it is a problem of a pirza. However, if it is in the corner, even less than 10 amos is a problem. We paskin this rule because Pischa b'karen zavius la'avdi inchi, the shear is less than 10 amos. Mishnah Berurah explains that what is the definition of b'karen zavius? It doesn't just mean at the corner, it means that it takes out some of the wall on both sides of the corner. As long as the part of the two sides are missing where the corner is, at least a little bit on each side, that's called b'karen zavius, and we have a much stricter shear. How much people don't make such psachim over there, so that's a problem. Tzuras of Pesach would work over there. An actual Tzuras of Pesach, one, and one on top would be fine. But a simple breach that you want to treat as a Pesach because it's less than 10 amos or less, is a problem. So what is the share? The share is not 10 amos. What's the share? First, the Mishnah Berurah brings less than an amma ein lahachmer. If the breach is less than an amma wide, it's okay. Then he brings a Rashba who says that 3 to 4 tvachim is still a problem. But that less than 3 tvachim is okay. 3 to 4 tvachim is a problem, but you can fix it with 2 l'chayayim. And 4 tvachim or more, then you need that's a real problem. So that's a stricter share. That even less than an amma could be a problem if it's more than 3 or 4 tvachim. The contemporary Eruv work, the laws of an Eruv understands the Mishnah Berurah to be saying you should be strict and follow the Rashba that it's a tremendous chumrah that on a corner, even if it's a very small breach, only it can be less than a foot or so, a foot or around a foot. If that foot is on the corner, part of both walls are missing, that's already a problem, and it has to be corrected. How do you correct it? So the Mishnah Berurah noted that a Tzuras of Pesach would fix it. Chazon Ish has another solution. Find the spot of the exact corner, continue the imaginary lines of the two walls to where the corner should have been had there not been the breach. Put a single pole over there. At that point, he says, that now we have two breaches, one on each side. We don't have one single breach anymore. So at that point, you don't need a whole Tzuras Pesach. You just need one pole in the corner, and that reduces the breach B'Keren Zavis to two small breaches, one on each side, and those small breaches have the regular rules. There are a breach on each side, they're less than 10 amas, and they're fine. The Gemara goes on, the Gemara discusses Mavoi Akum, an alley that instead of running straight, has a kink, has a bend in the middle of the Mavoi. The Gemara brings Machlokes Amoraim. Rav says Terasik Mefulash, we treat it as a Mavoi Mefulash. Shmuel says we treat it as Terasik Isasum. The Gemara has a complex discussion about this in this daf and future dafim. There's a major machlokes rishonim what the Gemara means exactly, how we paskin, and what the Gemara means about the chumrah of Terasik Mefulash, where some rishonim say the chumrah here is not just the tikkunim on both ends of the mavoi, the mouths of the mavoi, you actually need a tikkun in the middle where it bends. Very unusual din, that besides fixing the edges of the mavoi, you also have to put some kind of tikkun in the center of the mavoi where it has that bend. Other rishonim say no, that's not what the Gemara means. The Shulchan Aruch is actually machmer on this. The Shulchan Aruch says mavoi akum, like a dalid, the right angle mavoi. So it's mefulash ba'achmimus. We treat it as if it's mefulash in that point in the middle where it bends. And you need a Tzuras Pesach over there. You need a Tzuras Pesach in the middle of the mavoi right there. The Biur Halacha explains at some length. It's actually a machlokes. This chumrah is the sheet of Rashi and many other rishonim, which the Shulchan Aruch paskins like. Many other rishonim disagree. He says the Ri and the Rashba say you don't need a tikkun in the middle. Other rishonim go like that. He says, how do we paskin? So when you have a mavoi akum, a mavoi as part of your eruv that bends, do you need any kind of tikkun in the middle? So the Mishnah Berurah says, Biur Halacha explains at greater length. So in our mavoi, we said earlier that our mavoi is really a chatzar because we don't have the batim chatzeres psuchos l'tofos. Our mavoi is treated like a chatzar. So by chatzar, we have additional basis for leniency that the whole chumrah of the Gemara of mavoi akum is about a mavoi. Our mavoi, we call it a mavoi, but it has a din of a chatzar. So earlier we said it has a din of a chatzar l'chumrah, that you can't use lechi b'kara. This is a major discussion whether we say our mavoi is like a chatzar l'kula, that it shouldn't have the chumrah of mavoi akum. But the Mishnah Berurah says certainly you can rely on that our mavoi is considered a chatzar, and anyway, now Rishonim agree there's a chumrah of mavoi akum to begin with to have a tikkun in the middle. Certainly he says our mavos, there's basis for you can be makil and not do the thing about the tikkun in the middle. Mishnah Berurah says even in the case of a real mavoi akum, the Biur Halacha says that b'shas v'tchak, you don't have to be choshesh for Rashi, even if it's a genuine mavoi. B'shas v'tchak, you can be make it like the other rishonim, even in the mavoi of the shas, to say that the Gemara doesn't mean mavoi akum needs a tikkun in the middle. So the Mishnah Berurah says our mavos, contemporary mavos, we don't have this special chumrah of making tikkun in the middle. Not all Achronim agree though. Achronim point out it's not so clear that, again, as we noted earlier, to say that our mavoi is not a mavoi, even lakula, that it shouldn't need a tikkun in the middle, is not so simple. In particular, the Chura Shai, Rav Shlomo Yehuda Tabak says, he has a question, he says, are our Eruvin absolutely kosher, or do our Eruvin have a number of debatable leniencies that would leave room for a Bal Nefesh to be stringent? He says, yes, actually they do. Our Eruvin do have a number of compromises we make with pragmatism to enable the making of an Eruv. And one of them is this, he says. Number 2 on his list is, he says, that we don't do anything about mavoi akum. We don't do these tikkunim where the mavos bend in middle. And according to some rishonim, it's a problem. And even though our mavoi, there's basis for leniency, we said, at the end of the day, the Chura Shai considers this one of the reasons why a Bal Nefesh might not want to use our Eruvin, because we disregard the chumrah of this Gemara about mavoi akum. The Gemara discusses glossos, doors. The Gemara says Yerushalayim, the city of Yerushalayim, were it not for the fact that it has doors that are neulos, that are closed at night, would be a Rishus Harabim, when you'd be chayav chatas for carrying in Yerushalayim. The Gemara says Avulei d'Mechuza, another city in Bavel, it says, were it not for the fact that it had doors that were neulos, you'd be chayav again because of Rishus Harabim. The Gemara drills down, what do we mean that the doors are closed? It has doors, the doors have to be closed, tzarech linol or ain't tzarech linol. So the Gemara has a shaila, then the Gemara says, again, do they have to be closed or not? So it brings that in Avulei d'Neharda, that area of Neharda, it says they had earth, that the doors were blocked with earth, and they couldn't be closed. So the Gemara says that doesn't mean tzarech linol. That means simply ru'uyos linol. The doors have to be able to be closed. If it's full of earth, everyone agrees that's not good because they can't be closed. If they could be closed but they're not closed, that's the shayla in the Gemara. How do we paskin? Shulchan Aruch paskins the basic din. If you have a reshus harabim, you need doors, you need glasos, and the doors have to be ninolos balayla. They have to be, we paskin tzarech linol. As to the question of ru'uyos linol, is that enough? So that the Shulchan Aruch brings two opinions. He said the first shita says ninolos, they have to actually be closed at night. Yesh Amrim, they don't have to be closed all day, but they have to actually be closed at night. The Yesh Amrim, the second opinion is, even if they're not ninolos, they have to be, it's enough if they're ru'uyos linol, as opposed to if they're blocked with earth. But if they're ru'uyos linol, even if they aren't actually, as a matter of actual fact, closed at night, that is sufficient. How do we paskin about this machlokus? So the Mishnah Berurah says, since the Mechaber brought the first shita b'stam, that's a standard klal in the Shulchan Aruch, he brings the first opinion as this is the halacha, then he adds a second opinion, lenient opinion in this case, as a yesh omrim, mashma d'daito k'dei harishona, that they have to actually be closed, ru'uyos linol is not enough. Now, poskim have all kinds of discussions about what does it mean, ru'uyos linol. For example, poskim discuss cases where the door is physically able to be closed, but the government controls it. The government won't let us close it. The government might have gates that it closes occasionally in emergencies. They'll let us build some kind of gate as long as we promise them we're not going to actually obstruct traffic even at night. Is that enough if they're physically able to be closed? There's no earth blocking them, but the government doesn't let. That's a major machlokas among the 19th century poskim. There's even an idea in the great Eruvin debates in New York in the 20th century. Some poskim actually argued that red lights, traffic lights, would be considered like glasos because they block traffic. They don't block traffic all the time, but they sometimes do. Even though it's a legal and civil block, rather a societal block, rather than obstruction, rather than a physical one. The Klosenberger and Divrei Yatzir proposed the idea that would be enough to be considered dalsos nulos. Other poskim didn't agree, certainly. But anyway, that's the idea of glasos. The Gemara says if you have reshus harabim, like Yerushalayim, like other cities, they need glasos, an ordinary eruv that we make. The eruv that we make with Tzuras HaPesach, with strings and PVC and so on, would not be enough for a reshus harabim. That's what the Mishnah Berurah points out from the Shulchan Aruch. It's a major discussion in the Gemara and the Rishonim, but from the Shulchan Aruch, it's clear that for a reshus harabim, daraisa, a bona fide, true blue reshus harabim, you need glasos, you need doors that are at least ru'uyos linol at night, and not simply the eruv that we make. Says the Mishnah Berurah, of course, we don't do this. The Eruvin we make today, the Eruvin we made in the Mishnah Berurah's time, were the Eruv that we make with poles and strings, but there were no glasos. So why we make it, he says. We have reshus harabims, it seems, so why we make them? So he says that you have to say we're somech on the idea that we don't have reshus harabim daraisa because we follow the opinion that we've mentioned here and there that you need shishim ribu, you need 600,000 people traversing a space for it to be reshus harabim. Traversing a road, being in a city to be reshus harabim. We don't have that. We don't have reshus harabim to begin with, so we don't need glasos. Only cities, only places that are real reshus harabims need glasos, and we're somech on the opinions that we don't have a reshus harabim. This is one of the most fundamental debates, one of the most fundamental issues in Eruvin, that our Eruvin that don't have glasos, many poskim say, are based on the idea, are hinge on the fact that we don't have a reshus harabim daraisa. Because we're somech on the shita that it's not a reshus harabim daraisa until you have shishim ribo, and we don't have shishim ribo. That's why Ramosha was so machmer in Brooklyn, because he held there was shishim ribo over there. But we have to say two things. You have to say to be mekel on an eruv without glasos. You have to say that you need shishim ribo to be called reshus harabim daraisa. Without that, it's not reshus harabim daraisa. And then you have to say that we don't have shishim ribo, so we're mekel. Mishnah Berurah says the halacha is not so clear. The halacha, it's a major machlokes rishonim whether this shishim ribo thing is not mentioned in the Gemara anywhere. It's mentioned in the Gaonim and the Rishonim. Some of them say it, but not all of them agree. So can you be mekel based on that or not? So Mishnah Berurah says the minig is to be mekel. Many Achronim say the minig was to be mekel for centuries in Europe to be somech on Shitas Rashi, the Gaonim, that without shishim ribo there's no reshus harabim daraisa and therefore no need for glasos. However, the Mishnah Berurah brings b'shem Achronim. You can't be mochen someone else, he says, who wants to be mekel. However, he says kol bal nefesh yachmer la'atzmo. A bal nefesh should be machmer himself, not to rely on an eruv that doesn't have glasos. This is probably the most famous reason why people are stringent about Eruvin, because modern Eruvin typically don't have glasos, and they rely then on the assumption that we don't have Rosh Hashanah Daraisa, and that's a highly debatable assumption. So that's the Mishnah Berurah and other Achronim say that a person that a Bal Nefesh should be machmer. You shouldn't object to someone else who wants to carry in the Erev, but a Bal Nefesh personally should not carry. This is also on the Shura Shai's list of reasons not to use modern Eruvin. Other Achronim as well say that modern Eruvin are somewhat dubious. You can't object to someone who uses one, but it's often not really lechatchila. On Daf Zayin, again, the sugya begins on Davav, goes on to Daf Zayin. The Gemara talks about Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, whether a person is allowed to follow Beis Shammai or not. So the Gemara makes a distinction. There was a baskol from heaven that said, a heavenly voice that said, Halacha K'dik Beis Hillel. So before the baskol came, Beis Shammai was still a legitimate opinion. After the baskol came, the Gemara wants to say Beis Hillel is settled. The Beis Shammai is no longer a viable opinion. Ibayasema, the Gemara says, even la'achar baskol, it's not quite settled, because according to Rabbi Yeshua is lamashkach baskol. Rabbi Yeshua famously said, Lo b'shamayim hi, when the baskol in the story of Tanur Shel Achnoi, Rabbi Eliezer said, if I'm right, let a baskol say, I'm right, let Shemayim show that I'm right. The baskol said he's right. Rabbi Yeshua said, no, lamashkach baskol. Rabbi Yeshua doesn't accept baskol because of Torah Lo b'shamayim hi. And others apparently, the Gemara has another tzad that we do. Rabbi Yeshua says that we don't. Tosfos asks a contradiction. Here the Gemara says that here it seems we do pass like Beis Hillel. We follow the baskol, we pass like Beis Hillel. But in the story of Tanur Shel Achnoi, where there was a baskol, Rabbi Yeshua said, Lo b'shamayim. So there we follow Rabbi Yeshua. The Gemara brings Rabbi Yeshua here, but here it seems that we do follow the baskol. At least according to one opinion, we follow the baskol. So Tosfos says that really, in principle, we do follow baskals. We don't accept Rabbi Yeshua's hardline view that baskals are completely out of bounds for Torah. We do accept baskals. Over there, we didn't accept the baskal for one of two reasons. Either because that baskal was just to defend the honor of Rabbi Eliezer. He was feeling slighted by the Chachamim, so the baskal came to defend him, to defend his dignity. But it wasn't a genuine opinion of heaven, or because there was a question of rov. There was acharam lahatos. Rabbi Eliezer was outnumbered, and the Torah told us to follow the rov. So there, since the baskal would run against one of the canons of psak, so we ignore the baskal. But here, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, he says, Beis Hillel was the rov. So anyway, there's still a question of who the baskal like, but the baskal certainly wasn't going against the rov. So here we can follow the baskal. The Tosfos seems very open to following the baskal, as long as we believe, or have no reason not to believe, that it was a baskal just for someone's kavod, as long as it doesn't contradict a major halachic principle like acharam lahatos. Tosfos seems to feel that we do follow baskals in matters of Torah. We can, in some cases, follow baskals. Rambam is not so clear. There are a number of different passages where he talks about the idea of Torah Lo b'shamayim hi, but in some of them at least, Rambam seems to take a very strict line that nevuah, divine communication, is completely illegitimate when it comes to Torah. In one place, the Rambam says, if a Navi comes and tells us, if he's oker something in the Torah, he tells us not to do something in the Torah, or even if he just says, halacha k'divrei ploni. We have machlokes, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. The Navi says, halacha k'divrei ploni. It's a Navi sheker. There's no such thing. It cannot be. He's a Navi sheker, and he is executed. So the Rambam seems to say, he can't even say halacha k'divrei ploni. No baskal at all. So here the Gemara just blithely talks about a baskal saying halacha k'beis Hillel. The Rambam says no such thing. So the Achronim, starting the Kesef Mishnah, going down, struggle greatly with this question. How can the Rambam just say Ein mashkichin b'baskal, that it's you kill the Navi who says that, but the Gemara has no problem here saying that you follow the baskal. It brings Rabbi Yeshua that you don't, but the Gemara doesn't feel it's outright heresy and completely illegitimate to say you follow a baskal. So there are a variety of approaches in the Achronim. Our Sameach says that the baskal cannot say tahar, tameh, chayav, pater, asur, mutter. The baskal can say the halacha should be like Beis Hillel in general. Just like there are other klalim in the Gemara, we follow certain Amoraim because they were experts in din. For example, he brings that we follow Shmuel Bedini because he frequented the house of Rav Nachman, who had many dinei Torah. So we're not passing an individual shayla. We're telling you there wasn't a baskal. There we just said Shmuel was an expert in din, so we pass like him in general. So a baskal can say Beis Hillel is someone who usually gets the halacha right. Beis Hillel has those qualities of judgment, of judiciousness. they're the ones who usually get it right because they were anavim, because they listened to the other side more and they were open-minded. So that elsewhere we say that's why we paskin like Beis Hillel, because it says that they were nochim zelazeh, that they listened to each other and they studied each other's words. So that's a reason we paskin like them. So the Baskel wasn't just saying on the halachas that they ruled on they are right. It wasn't paskin the underlying issues. It was saying they have the qualities of mind, the qualities of spirit, for the halacha to be like them. That the Baskel can do, since the Baskel is not directly telling us the halacha. The Chida has a famous discussion of this in his Shem HaGedolim, in his intellectual biographies of Gedolei Torah throughout the centuries, under his entry for Rabbi Yaakov HaChassid, Rabbi Yaakov of Marves, one of the Balei Tosfos, who asked questions, put questions to heaven and received answers and wrote them down in a book called She'elos Utshuvas Min HaShamayim. So the Chida discusses this question at some length. What happened to the Rambam? What happened to Torah Lo B'Shamayim? How can you do that? He brings our Gemara. Our Gemara says you could follow the Baskel. That's why we pass like Beis Hillel, according to some opinions at least. So he brings numerous other Rishonim back and forth. So at one point he wants to say it's actually Machlokes. The Rambam is not the last word on the subject. Other Rishonim disagree. At the end he says that even the Rambam may agree. The Rambam just says if the halacha is one way, then the Navi can't comment. But if the Sanhedrin themselves weren't sure that Sanhedrin hasn't reached a conclusion, they heard arguments both ways, and Sanhedrin is unable to reach a conclusion, then the Navi can say, the Baskel can say, this is what God says, go this way, not that way. He's not really coming with anything new. He's just reinforcing one of two sides, which we already knew about. So the Chida concludes that Torah Lo B'Shamayim, again, similar to Tosfos, first of all, the Rambam's view may be machlokes, and even according to the Rambam, there are some cases at least where Nevuah, prophecy, or Baskel is acceptable. And indeed, in other cases, the Chida actually gives some weight to the Tshuvas Min HaShamayim on the grounds that it's not totally improper to rely on a Baskel. Others disagree. Rav Adi Yosef has a long discussion of this in whether you follow Baskel or not, and he inclines to the view that you don't follow any kind of thing Min HaShamayim. The cases of Tshuvas Min HaShamayim have to do with dreams and Chalom, and that's a little bit different, he says. But Lahalacha, the Rambam is the Iker, that we don't follow divine revelation in matters of halacha. He discusses at some length the Chida's distinctions. He says there are many other Achronim who reject the Chida and say that it's absolute, that we don't follow Nevu or Baskel at all. He brings numerous other Achronim, including the Gaon of Shevel, Rabbi Zechariah Stern, and says no such thing, we don't follow the Baskel at all. On Daf Ches, the Gemara talks about a Mavoi that, again, a Mavoi is openings at one or both ends, and they have to be fixed somehow. They have to be sealed off, not physically sealed, but some kind of tikkun to close them up halachically. And Dafkas, the Gemara talks about a case where one end of the mavui is kol liyam. It ends in a body of water. It ends in the sea. So the Gemara brings a debate about whether we're choshesh that the yam itself would be a mechitza, would be considered a valid. That's a wall. That's considered a wall. There's a concern that maybe the yam will be mala sirton. It'll throw up material that will cause it to stop being. We're talking about the seabed that drops away. So if stuff, sediment and earth is piled up there until it's flat at the end, that can eliminate the mechitza. So there's machlokes whether there's gzeira, you have to worry that'll happen and you won't realize. That's what the Gemara says. Lahalacha we paskin that the yam is a mechitza. Ein tzarich klum. If you have one end of the mavi ending in the yam is a mechitza. And you're not choshesh, we paskin leniently, we're not choshesh that it'll dry out and it will and it will turn into either sediment, like I said, or just choshesh that it'll dry out. That I may have said it incorrectly. That it'll turn into dry land one way or another, and it won't be mechitza. We're not choshesh for that. Again, yesh cholkim. The Rama brings an opinion that we are choshesh shemayala hayam sirton. How do we paskin again? Mishnah Berurah says it's kimu akron lahachrik kadezu l'chatchila. We are choshesh for shemayala hayam sirton. The basic idea, though, that the yam is called to mechitza is of huge practical importance. Many modern Eruv situations, municipal Eruvin, get involved in this question. If you have an island, Manhattan, you have a city that's on an island, and the water around it, rivers, oceans, they can be a mechitza, according to this din, as long as you're not choshesh for sirton. And Mishnah Berurah tells you that in certain cases you're not choshesh for sirton. There are various cases where we're not worried about sirton. For example, the Mishnah Berurah talks about rivers. Yam, he says, is a problem of sirton. Rivers don't have the problem of sirton. Rivers could be a good mechitza. So people discussed using the rivers. Making the area very easy if you can use the rivers, the natural rivers, as boundaries. So there's a major debate about whether you can actually use bodies of water as boundaries in modern practical scenarios. The Magen Avram has a great chumrah. The Magen Avram says that if ships dock here, if ships land on the beaches here, land on the docks, then we say asi rabim mavatli mechitza. A mechitza that is traversed by traffic, by a significant amount of traffic, is an invalid mechitza. Even though we paskin lo asi rabim mavatli mechitza, but here, based on a Tosfos, he says if it's a natural mechitza, a human mechitza that was made out of walls by humans, is one thing. A natural mechitza like the river, then we say asi rabim mavatli mechitza. So if the ships traverse the riverbank, then it would not be a mechitza, and you lose the ability to use the river or the sea as a mechitza. The Gemara says it is. The Gemara is talking about whether there are no ships over there. That's the Magen Avram. Many Achronim disagree and say that there's no such chumrah, that this Tosfos, we don't go like that. They say that even if ships do land on this beach or this dock, it doesn't matter. Lo asi rabim v'ashli mechitza. The river or the sea is always considered a valid mechitza. How do we paskin? Many poskim are choshesh for this. Many poskim are choshesh for the Magen Avram that if there are ships traversing that land there, it's a problem. They have all kinds of chilukim, technical chilukim. The way Rav Blau puts it in the Siva Shabbos is there are all kinds of chilukim. He's not getting into them. He says because manoshah. If a person is looking to be mekel, he can just not hold like the Magen Avram at all and go like the other Achronim who say lo asi rabim v'ashli mechitza. It doesn't matter if there are ships here. And if there are people who want to be machmer, then all these chilukim with Achronim, he says, based on these subtle chilukim, he says you should be machmer, and you shouldn't go like those chilukim anyway. You should just be machmer, not to use the bodies of water as a mechitza. The Mishnah Berurah also talks about bridges. If there are bridges that cross over the rivers, which obviously is the case in Manhattan and many modern scenarios of cities that are bounded by rivers. So again, the Mishnah Berurah says, Mashrim mikam achronim, many achronim indicate that the same problem as the Magen Avram occurs, that the gesher, the bridge, the people traveling over the bridge, is mevatel the mechitza, and then you need to throw the Pesach over the bridge, which creates headaches. And again, these questions were discussed heavily in the context of the modern Eruvin, the Eruvin in New York, I think, and other Eruvin, how to deal with this question of asi rabim mevatli mechitza with regard to bridges and boats when it comes to using the river as a mechitza. The whole idea of using the river as a mechitza is because the riverbank is steep, that if it's 10 tefachim steep, but if it's, again, the rule is it has to go 10 tefachim within 4 amos. If the slope is very gradual, the fact that it's covered with a shallow layer of water is not going to be a mechitza to begin with. The Mishnah Berurah says on Sirton that it has to do with, like I said before, throwing up not just drying out, but throwing up the sand and the stones and becoming ground. The Mishnah Berurah also talks about another question that was very practical in Europe. It was, I believe, heavily discussed in Europe. What about rivers that freeze in the winter? So when it freezes, it's like solid ground. So is it still a mechitza when the river freezes over? When the river is liquid, then if it's a steep bank, we look at the bank as the mechitza, even though it's covered with water. But when the river freezes, what happens then? So the Mishnah Berurah says that when it's frozen, it's not a mechitza, and at that point the eruv becomes invalid if you're relying on the water. And in the Siva Shabbos brings, some poskim say that in that case it's also even in the summer, even when it's not frozen. Why? Because the same way the Gemara says there's a possible concern with Shema Yala Hayam Sirton. Maybe the water, if it throws up sediment and becomes solid land, it's a gzeira. You shouldn't use the eruv at all because you might not realize when that happens. Maybe you shouldn't use the eruv even in the summer because you start using it in the fall, I guess, and you won't realize that it got frozen over. Some poskim are machmer even in the summer. You shouldn't use a river that freezes during the winter, or at least you shouldn't use it when there's a chance it'll get frozen. I'm not sure if they mean all year or close to the winter, but you shouldn't use it at all. And some say and the Mishnah Berurah just brings that it's a problem while it's frozen, and some Achronim are lenient entirely, and they say even when it's frozen, it doesn't matter. It's still considered a valid mechitza. One final point, even when you can't use the river itself, if the river bank itself above the water has a steep enough slope to be able to be a mechitza, that's fine. Any hill and any sufficiently steep hill is considered a valid mechitza, and that's fine. On Daf Tes, the Gemara talks about a lechi, different types of configurations of bends in the openings of chatzers. The Gemara talks about questions of nirim b'fnim v'shavim b'chutz. if the lechi is visible from inside but not distinct from the outside, or vice versa. Nirim b'chutz v'sham b'fnim, it can be seen on the outside but not on the inside. The Gemara has various debates, various discussions about these things. Lahalacha we paskin that either one is okay. If the lechi is visible from inside or outside, either way, it is kosher. Now again, we don't make lechis today. As we said several times, we only make tzuras of Pesach. But the question is, do these halachas apply to tzuras of Pesach? Now even the Shulchan Aruch said everything is fine, inside or outside. But it has to be apparently one or the other. If it's not nikar at all, if a lechi would be invisible, would be indistinct, both to people inside the mavoi and to people outside the mavoi, that wouldn't be good. And therefore the post can debate, what about tzuras of Pesach? Various situations in which you have a tzuras of Pesach which is not distinct, is not clearly visible at all, inside the mavoi, outside the mavoi, inside the chatzar, outside the chatzar, is that a valid tzuras of Pesach? Does the tzuras of Pesach have to be visible and distinct? So there are several achronim who are machmir in various such cases. One of the most important is the Tvu Ashar. Tvu Ashar talks about a case of putting the kanim, the vertical poles of the tzuras of Pesach, behind the wall in a place where they can't clearly be seen. It's like Agamar, they have to be near us somewhere at least. If you can't see them, it's not good. Rikveger disagrees. Rikveger at some length argues and says, a lechi is not a real wall. A lechi is just a hecker. It has to it has to be visible, it has to be distinct. People can see it and realize I can carry till here and not further. Tzuras of Pesach is a mechitza, nothing to do with hecker. Tzuras of Pesach is just a wall. It doesn't matter if it's nicker or not, and therefore it is fine. A middle ground position is the Yeshuas Yaakov. The Yeshuas Yaakov says he accepts in principle the Tvu Ashar's idea that it has to be nicker. However, he says the Tzuras of Pesach is nicker, because even if you can't see the poles because they're blocked by walls, you can see the thing on top, the thing that goes across, you can see that. So that's fine, even if it needs to be nicker. However, he says, if the kana is above 20 amos, the very first line in the Masechta was if the kara is too high, then the Gemara explains you can't see it, so it's possible. We said at the time that we don't have a kara, we don't do kara, so then it's not a problem. But we only make tzuras of Pesach. Tzuras of Pesach can be higher also. However, but if the vertical poles are not visible because they're behind the wall, and if the two vertical ones are not visible because they're behind the wall, and the horizontal one on top is also not visible because it's too high, then he says you have a problem. Another case they talk about where there's a major dispute, a very practical and common question that comes up, which hinges to an extent on whether a tzuras of Pesach has to be nicker, it has to be distinct, is the case where the tzuras of Pesach is made inside a yard, inside a house, or inside a yard, inside fences. This is a very common question. You want to put a tzuras of Pesach inside an enclosed area, or they build a construction fence around it after it's built. This is a famous chumrah of the Makar Chaim, Rav Yaakov Loberbaum, the Nesivos, the Chavas Das. In his very brief one-page Tikkun Eruvin, he wrote briefly that people sometimes put the vertical poles of the tzuras of Pesach inside houses, or inside a fence. He says, Vadei lav klum, the Eruv is puzzle, because he gives two reasons. He kind of mixes two reasons together. One reason is technical, basic command animalia, but the other reason he says is the lechi has to be visible, b'shvil heker. Lechi has to be distinct, paralleling the Tvu Ashar, a lechi has to be visible. There's a tremendous amount of controversy about whether the Makar Chaim is right or not. Major debate among the Achronim, l'chatchila, we generally try to be machmer on this, but there's some room for leniency. But in all the arguments back and forth, one of the key questions is the Makar Chaim correct that a lechi that there has to be a hecker? That the tzuras of Pesach has to have a hecker. Lechi, the Gemara says, needs to be nicker. But does the tzuras of Pesach have to be nicker? That's machlokes. There are Achronim who endorse the Makar Chaim. Shlomo Kluger says, Kol tzuras of Pesach b'inan she'ei nicker la'ovrim. It has to be nicker. It has to be visible. People have to be able to see it, and therefore he would agree with the Makar Chaim. Other posts can disagree. On Daf Yud, the Gemara talks about, again, back to Omein Meruba. So again, Omein Meruba and Paretz Meruba, a gap which is mostly filled or mostly empty, is a concept that the Gemara is going to be invoking repeatedly over these dafim. Here, the Gemara talks about two questions involving Omein Meruba and Paretz Meruba. One of them is Omein Meruba mishtei ruchos. If you have a certain gap, and there is Omein Meruba, most of the gap is full. However, not in one spot. You have two separate pieces of Omeid that combined are more than the parts, but each one individually is less than the parts. You have 4 amos Omeid. From the corner, you have 4 amos Omeid, and then you have 5 amos parts, and then you have 4 amos Omeid. So is that a good mechitza or not? On the one hand, the parts is meruba for each of the individual omeids. If you divide and conquer, the parts is meruba. If you combine the two omeids, you have 8, and 8 is greater than 5. Is that good or not? The Gemara goes back and forth on this question of whether omeid meruba mishnei tzadim is good or not, mishnei ruchos is good or not. The Gemara has another rule called asi avira dahagisa v'hagisa mavatale. If you have an omeid, and avira on each side is greater than it, then the avir is mevatel, together is mevatel the omeid. These two rules often intersect and overlap, and exactly how to untangle them and how to decide which one to apply is very tricky. But taking these two rules one at a time, the first rule of omeid meruba mishnei tzadim, how do we paskin? Do we paskin omeid meruba has to be combined omeid, or you can combine multiple omeids? Mishnah Berurah says yesh omrim. The Shulchan Aruch is not clear. There isn't a clear hachra on this question in the Shulchan Aruch. The Mishnah Berurah says yesh omrim that mishnei tzadim is good, and not only that, the Mishnah Berurah says you can iterate. You can actually recursively apply the rule of omeid meruba, and you can actually end up in a case where sum total of the omeid is less than the parts, but by recursively iterating the omeid, it can actually be a good mechitza. Concrete example: let's say you have a 15 amma gap, and the space is as follows. Starting from one corner to the other corner, you have 1 amma omeid, 1 amma parts, 2 ammas omeid. So on the 4 on the left side, you have 1 yes, 1 no, and then 2 yes. So out of those 4 ammas, it's 3 out of 4 omeid and 1 parts. Assuming you hold omeid mishnei tzadim is good, so you add the 2 to the 1 and you get 3, and 3 is greater than 1. So out of the first 4 on the left, you have a total of 3 omeid, and we say omeid meruba, so that gap is considered 4 ammas straight. On the other corner, the first 4 ammas on the other side, you have the same thing. 1, and then 1 yes, and 1 no, and 2 yes. 1 omeid, 1 parts, and 2 omeid. So that also, out of those 4 ammas, you have 3 out of 4 omeids. You look at those 4 ammas as omeid. Now that we have 4 and 4, we iterate those. We say 4 plus 4, mishnei tzadim, and 7 in the middle. The total is 15. So 4 plus 7 plus 4 is 15, but I have 4 plus 4 is 8. 8 is greater than 7. So I have, first I do the 2 omeid merubas on the 2 4 amma sections on each side. Now that we look at them as being completely omeid, I add those two together and I have 8, and 8 is more than 7. Even though the total omeid I have is only 6, I only have 1 and 2 and 2 and 1, then 6 out of 15 is 6 versus 9. It doesn't matter. Yesh omrim, we say omeid merubah ala paretz, even if you have to do mishnei tzadim. 4 plus 4 is 8, is greater than 7. 2 plus 1 together is 3, is greater than 1. And even multiple times, you do this. Mishnah Berurah says yesh omrim. In the Laws of an Arab book, they say that the Mishnah Berurah from the Shartzian, it's muchat that he holds like this. L'alacha l'maisa, he's somech that we do say omeid merubah mishnei tzadim. The others disagree. Other poskim are choshesh for the Rashba, who says we don't say omeid merubah mishnei tzadim. And l'halacha, it's not entirely clear. Minchas Yitzchak says if you're dealing with a karmelis, which is only a din d'Rabbanan, you can be samech on mishnei tzadim. For a deraisa, you shouldn't be samech on it. That's one of the two dinim in the Gemara, omeid merubah. The other question, is if you have, so let's say for example, you have a piritz of 10 amas. You have a wall that's maybe 50 amas long, and most of it is full. You have 20 on one side, 20 on the other side, and 10 in the middle. So it's not a problem of omeid merubah. You certainly have omeid merubah, but a piritz of 10 amas, and more than 10 amas, is a problem. Let's say I want to fix the problem. I want to take a single pole and stick it in the middle. So now I have 2 different piritzes, one on each side. Each one is less. Each one is only 5 amas or so, 5 or 6 amas. Is that okay? No, that's not okay, because asi avira dahagisa mavatala, since that little lonely pole in the middle is surrounded by open air, the space on each side is mavatal the pole is command delesa, and that does not work. On Daf Yud Aleph, the Gemara talks about a modern Eruvin that are made out of mostly empty space, lots of windows or doors, or even just taking 4 kundisim, 4 poles, and putting things on top of them. The Gemara talks about whether you can make an Eruv. On the one hand, it's really paretz merubah ala omeid. It's mostly empty space. On the other hand, you have Tzuras HaPesachs. That's how our Eruvin are made. They're made out of mostly open space between telephone poles and so on, and with lechis and strings and wires on top of them. But it's mostly open space. The Gemara brings an opinion that is not good, but that's working within a shita of Rav. That we don't paskin like. So the Gemara is not entirely clear how we paskin halacha l'maisa on this question. Lahalacha, most poskim, most rishonim, and the Shulchan Aruch paskin that lahalacha this is fine. The Shulchan Aruch says if you make a Tzuras Pesach works even if the Peretz is less than 10, the Peretz is more than 10. A Peretz more than 10 is normally a problem, but it can be rectified with Tzuras Pesach. Indeed, that's how we make our Eruvin. Our Eruvin typically have Tzuras Pesachs that go for dozens of feet, sometimes hundreds of feet long. They can go for, I'm told that on our Beltway we have one of the longest Tzuras Pesachs in the world, where it goes from two hills across a valley, one on each side, several hundred feet across, a wire across them. So Tzuras Pesach can go well more than 10 amos. And even if the space is mostly parrots, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that's fine. Even 4 condisim, an Eruv can be made out of 4 condisim, 4 poles on 4 points on a rectangle or a square, wires on top. It's almost all parrots. It's more than 10 amos. It is all fine. With one exception, in a bika, in an isolated area where there are no diurim, you can't do that. But in a normal Eruv where people live, you're allowed to make such an Eruv. Then he brings, however, Shitas HaRambam. Shulchan Aruch says that the Rambam says that you can't have 2 problematic factors present in the same Eruv. You can't have a appearance of more than 10 amos covered by a Tzuras of Pesach combined with B, Parat Meruba. You can have either one. You can have your appearances of more than 10 amos with the Tzuras of Pesach, provided that overall you have Omin Meruba, it's mostly solid wall, or you can have Parat Meruba with Tzuras of Pesachs, provided the Tzuras of Pesachs are not 10 amos. If you have both together, which is our modern Eruvin, we have Parat Meruba, typically, generally, in modern large Eruvin, they're Parat Meruba, they're mostly just poles and wires, and those poles are more than 10 amos apart. According to the Rambam, that is not good. The Rambam is a minority view. We don't paskin like it lahalacha. However, the Mishnah Berurah says, once again, nachon lachush divrei Rambam. The Rambam is not a das yachid. Other Rishonim hold like that too, the smak and the smak. Again, nachon, a person should not rely on a modern Eruv, on most modern Eruvin, because they fail to satisfy the condition of the Rambam. So yet again, another reason why modern municipal Eruvin are problematic. You can't be mocha. You're allowed to rely on it, but it is another reason why a Bal Nefesh, why the right thing to do, the Mishnah Berurah says, the appropriate thing to do is not to rely on the modern Eruv. There's an interesting machlokes. The Chasam Sofer says, if you want to fix up this kind of Eruv to satisfy the Rambam, just add poles. Under the Tzuras of Pesach, every 10 amos or so, stick other poles in. Chazon Ish doesn't accept that. The Chazon Ish says that it doesn't work. If your Eruv is fundamentally more than, the Tzuras of Pesach is more than fundamentally 10 amos apart, adding in additional poles doesn't work. If you don't have the poles, though, again, lahalacha, it's mutter, but nachon, the Mishnah Berurah says, to be stringent. The Gemara talks about, this Gemara has several other crucial, this daf has several other crucial halachas, crucial to the construction of Eruvin, to modern Eruvin, to any Eruvin. The Gemara talks about Tzuras of Pesach she'asam min hatzad. A Tzuras of Pesach min hatzad, on the side. The Gemara says that is not good. The Gemara says it's machlokes. We pass in Tzuras of Pesach she'asam min hatzad, on the side, is not good. What is a Tzuras of Pesach on the side? There are several opinions in the Rishonim. The one that is most commonly talked about is a Tzuras of Pesach. The Gemara says on Yud Aleph and Beis. The Gemara says Tzuras of Pesach is kana mikan, v'kana al gaben, 2 vertical poles surmounted by a horizontal pole. The horizontal pole must be directly above the vertical poles. If it's minatzad, if it's on the side of the vertical poles, that is not good. It must be perfectly aligned so that it is over and not on the side. That is how we paskin. Mishnah Berurah tells you it has to be mechuvan mamash. It can't be even a little bit off. No lavud. We don't even a kulshu. The Mishnah Berurah says if it's off to the side, a drop, it is not a problem. Even if it is a problem. Even if it's only one of the 2 kanim that's off, it's on top of one, but slightly off from the other. That is a problem. The Eruv is puzzle. This is one of the biggest headaches of modern Eruvin, making sure that the vertical poles or the strings or whatever they are is on top of the horizontal, that the horizontal pole is on top of the vertical pole and not off to the side of it. This is actually one of the issues Mishnah Berurah brings briefly. In the 19th century, there was a great debate when they began building telegraph wires. Today we have telephone wires, utility wires. When they began building the telegraph, can you use the telegraph as Tzuras of Pesach? It would be wonderful if you could. It's already built Tzuras of Pesach. Vertical poles, horizontal wires. Great. Save ourselves tons of work. So that's a tremendous machlokes achronim. One of the key issues was it's often minatzad. The wire on top is often not directly on top of the vertical pole. It's often on top of a crossbeam or stuck with insulators. It's often off to the side, and that may or may not be a valid Tzuras of Pesach. There's a tremendous debate on whether that on whether that works or not. There's another question, which is a very common question. This is discussed by contemporary poskim. Let's say the vertical poles are not perfectly straight. They're not perpendicular to the ground, are not normal to the flat surface of the ground. The Tzuras Pesach is at an angle. So the vertical pole is at an angle. So the horizontal pole on top does reach the top of the vertical pole, but then the vertical pole slopes out from underneath it. So is that a problem or not? So contemporary poskim disagree. The laws of an Eruv says, or Yashav and other poskim were very strict. They said the entire vertical pole has to be under the horizontal pole. So if it moves out underneath, it's not. So it has to be ramrod straight up in order for it to be kosher. Rav Aaron Kotler and other poskim said, as long as the top of the vertical pole is underneath the horizontal pole, that's fine. Even if lower down, it comes out from underneath it. Rav Moshe held that the entire thing has to be under. He wasn't as lenient as Rav Aaron, but Rav Moshe held a small deviation, a small movement is not a problem. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight, even though the Mishabur says minatzad, if it's off to the side, it's a problem, even a small amount. But in terms of the bending of the pole or the slant of the pole, that he says we don't have to be so machmer. As long as it's directly over on the top, even if it slants out slightly, it's okay. Within 3 tfachim, it's okay. But it has to be mostly straight, but not perfectly straight. Many modern Eruvin certainly don't satisfy Rav Yashav, as I understand it. Modern Eruvin, we commonly use PVC tubing on the sides of telephone poles. Again, the telephone wire is not directly on top of the telephone pole. So we put a PVC tube underneath it to serve as a lechi, and that PVC tube is carefully placed to be directly under the horizontal wire. So even though they can run it all the way to the top and make sure the top is directly underneath the wire, but on the bottom it might have to turn, it might have to avoid displacements on the pole and so on. It might have to, for various reasons, and the bottom of it might not be directly under the thing on top. So my understanding is that some Eruvin, at least today, are lenient on this, but there are poskim who are strict that in order to be called not minatzad, it has to go straight down. There are other questions. Let's say many questions involving minatzad. Let's say the wire on top begins on top of the pole on this side and on top of the pole on this side, but in between it sags or it sways to the side or the wind blows it or it's deflected by trees, or if you're using electrical wires that can be pulled out by other wires toward the houses. So even if the ends of the horizontal pole or wire are on top of the 2 vertical poles, what if the middle is not? It's sagging, swaying, or deflected. Major disputes among the poskim whether that's okay or not. Again, at least some of the Eruvin I've seen are very lenient on this. They allow considerable displacement in the wire and middle, but there are poskim who are much stricter and say that really the entire wire should be in a straight line from one lechi to the other. Again, yet another reason, if you're looking for them, why our Eruvin involve compromise, and perhaps, I don't know if poskim say this explicitly, but perhaps another reason why someone might ideally want to avoid using modern Eruvin. Another halacha the Gemara says, Pischei Shimai. A Pischei Shimai is not a valid Tzuras Pesach. Shimai means irregular. An irregular Pesach is not a valid Tzuras Pesach. What is an irregular Pesach? So the Rishonim have different explanations. Rashi says that they're not straight. The sides of the doorway are not straight. They have stones sticking out, protruding, stones going inward. It's not a regular, straight, normal doorway. There are other opinions in the Rishonim. Some say that the doorway missing parts, like missing a lintel, missing doorpost. The laws of an Eruv brings from Rav Moshe that even the Rishonim who don't define Shimai as regular, as being straight, they all agree to the basic idea that a Tzuras Pesach has to resemble something like an actual doorway, and a Tzuras Pesach that doesn't have straight sides, that has serpentine, curving sides, is not valid. So in cases where the vertical Tzuras Pesach, instead of being a straight line, a straight run up, starts curving and winding in different ways, for Moshe held that would be a problem according to all Rishonim. Again, this can be a problem with might be a problem with some of our Eruvin, where the vertical PVCs that we use for the vertical poles, ideally we try to go straight, but sometimes you can't. The question always is, junction boxes, other things that prevent them. The question is sometimes, how straight does it have to be before you're compromising on Pischei Shimai, before you're compromising on Pischei Shimai. In general, this is a major question in Eruvin. The Moshe says it has to look like a doorway. Having fishing line and electrical wires looks nothing like a doorway. The question is conceptually, in what way does it have to look like a doorway? This is something that frequently the Achronim debate. How doorway-like does the Tzuras Pesach actually have to be? On Amud Beis, one final halacha, a kula this time, a leniency. The Gemara brings the brisa, the classic brisa that defines Tzuras HaPesach. Tana, Tzuras HaPesach she'amru is kana mikan, one vertical pole on one side, kana mikan, another vertical pole on the other side, kana al gaben, horizontal pole on top. The Gemara says, Trichim liga, ain't Trichim liga. The vertical poles have to be at least 10 tefachim tall. But that's the halacha. But do they have to actually reach the horizontal pole or not? For example, we're building PVC lechis underneath a telephone wire. Can we just put up 10 tefachim, 40 inches or so on the bottom, and then use the wire on top as long as it's directly underneath it? Or do they have to be trichim liga? Do they have to run all the way up to the wire on top? The Gemara brings machlokas about it. Rav Nachman says ain't trichim liga. Rav Sheshes says trichim liga. Here we paskin ain't trichim liga. They don't have to touch. Now, normally we do make them that they do touch. Our PVCs run all the way up, my understanding is generally. That's partly for practical reasons. It's very hard, certainly without engineering and surveying equipment, to have things on the bottom be directly, again, even a cold shoe is a problem, being directly underneath the ones on top. So the easiest thing to do is to run them all the way to make sure that they're directly underneath. But la halacha ain't tzrichim liga. La halacha, they don't have to reach all the way that high. And this is something that's actually practically used very often. PVC is only an inch or two wide, so it's hard to align it directly without making it go all the way up. But sometimes we make an eruv where we use something much wider than PVC, especially for a makeshift interim eruv. We'll put a barrel underneath the wire, a barrel that's 40 inches high, or a board or something that's a wide board. We'll just stick it underneath the telephone pole, directly underneath the wire. That can be pretty easy to make sure it's directly underneath, and that's fine. So as long as the board or the barrel is 10 tefachim high, about 40 inches high, and it is directly underneath the wire, which you can, even with eyeball, you can make reasonably sure that it is, that's fine. It's machlokas in the Gemara, tzrichim liga or ain't tzrichim liga. We paskin ain't tzrichim liga as long as the lechi on the bottom is 10 tefachim high, and it's directly underneath the horizontal lechi on top. That is fine. The eruv is kosher.